The rain fell on Washington, D.C. that morning with a cold, political indifference. It was December 21, 1970, just 4 days before Christmas, and the city was a monochrome landscape of wet asphalt and granite ghosts. A black limousine, impossibly long and silent, cut through the gloom and pulled up to the northwest gate of the White House. From the back emerged a figure cloaked in myth and a purple velvet suit. Elvis Presley. He wasn't there to sing. He carried a letter, 6 pages long, handwritten on American Airlines stationery. It was a plea, a demand, and a confession, all addressed to the most powerful man in the world, President Richard Nixon. He wanted to be made a federal agent at large, a secret soldier in the war on drugs. But was this the desperate prayer of a patriot? A king offering his service to his country? Or was it the masterstroke of a man so suffocated by his own fame, so profoundly lost in a pharmaceutical haze, that he sought to wear the authority of the state like a shield, not to fight a war on the streets, but to win the one raging inside his own mind? The world knew Elvis as a god, but gods are not supposed to grow old or afraid. By 1970, the king was a prisoner in his own kingdom. Graceland had become a velvet-lined tomb, its gates a barrier not to keep the world out, but to keep him in. He lived his life in a twilight state, sleeping through the sunlit hours and rising as dusk fell, a nocturnal monarch ruling over an empire of shag carpets and deep-fried peanut butter sandwiches. His companions, the ever-present Memphis Mafia, were more than friends. They were his guards, his facilitators, his mirrors, reflecting back the version of himself he needed to see. But something was fracturing in the king's psyche. The man who had once terrified the establishment with a swivel of his hips now saw threats in every shadow. He saw the slow decay of American morality in the long hair of the hippies. He heard the siren song of cultural treason in the lyrics of the Beatles. They were, in his mind, a poison he believed he was uniquely qualified to fight. This belief was an obsession, and like all his obsessions, it demanded an artifact. A totem. It demanded a badge. He collected them with a feverish intensity. Police departments across the country, charmed by his celebrity, had bestowed upon him honorary badges, shiny trinkets that he wore with the gravity of a holy relic. But they were just that. Honorary. They held no real power. They couldn't stop the whispers in his own mind. They couldn't arrest the fear that was colonizing his soul. He needed something more. He needed federal authority. He needed the weight of the White House behind him. A power so absolute it could silence the screaming doubt that fame, money, and adoration never could. The letter he delivered that rainy December morning was a masterpiece of earnest delusion. He wrote of his love for his country, his deep concern for the drug-addled youth. He offered his services, not as a celebrity spokesman, but as a credentialed agent. He claimed he could infiltrate the dark heart of the counterculture, that he knew their music, their language, their weaknesses. He even criticized the very rock and roll movement he had created, suggesting the Beatles, specifically, were a prime example of anti-American sentiment. He was offering to become a spy against his own children. Inside the West Wing, the letter landed on the desk of a young aide named Egil Bud Krogh. To Krogh and his colleague Dwight Chapin, the letter was not the rambling of a troubled icon. It was a golden ticket. Their boss, Richard Nixon, was a man besieged. The Vietnam War raged, student protests paralyzed the nation, and the so-called silent majority felt their country slipping away. The president was seen as stiff, disconnected, a relic from a bygone era. What better way to bridge the cultural divide than a photo op with the king of rock and roll? It was a political masterstroke, a chance to co-opt a symbol of rebellion and make him an ally of the establishment. The call was made. A meeting was arranged with impossible speed. Elvis was summoned. But as he prepared to meet the president, he revealed another layer of his fractured reality. He wasn't coming empty-handed. He had gifts. Packed carefully among his entourage's luggage was a family treasure, a commemorative Colt .45 pistol from the Second World War, mounted in a handsome wooden display case. The king of rock and roll, a man known for increasingly erratic behavior and surrounded by whispers of prescription drug abuse, was bringing a firearm into the Oval Office to give to the President of the United States. The Secret Service was, to put it mildly, alarmed. The protocol was absolute. No private citizen, no matter how famous, brings a weapon into the presence of the commander-in-chief. The Memphis Mafia, led by Elvis's trusted friend Jerry Schilling, engaged in a frantic, hushed negotiation with White House security. The gun was a gift, they insisted, a symbol of respect. To refuse it would be an insult to the king. A tense compromise was reached. The gun would be surrendered to security and presented to the president later. The immediate crisis was averted. But the incident hung in the air, a metallic taste of the sheer unpredictability of the man they were about to let in the most secure room on the planet. Finally, the moment arrived. The doors to the Oval Office swung open. There stood Elvis Aaron Presley, a supernova of pop culture, dressed in a black velvet suit with a high collar, a massive gold belt buckle, and amber sunglasses. Across the thick carpet stood Richard Nixon, the embodiment of square Republican sobriety, in a simple blue suit, his posture rigid, his smile a carefully constructed political tool. It was a collision of two Americas, two opposing forces of nature, now occupying the same space. The air crackled with a strange, historic energy. They shook hands. The cameras flashed, capturing the surreal tableau for posterity. But the photographs tell only a fraction of the story. They don't capture the psychological chess match that unfolded. Nixon, the shrewd politician, saw a PR victory. He saw a way to humanize his image, to prove he wasn't the monster the protesters claimed he was. He was trying to win the future by embracing a ghost of the past. Elvis, however, saw something entirely different. He saw validation. He saw a man who, like him, was a king in a castle, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined. He launched into his pitch, his voice thick with Southern sincerity. He spoke of the hippies, the Black Panthers, the students for a democratic society. He painted a picture of a nation under siege from within. He wasn't just talking about drugs anymore. He was talking about a culture war. And he was choosing his side. Then, he went for the jugular. "The Beatles," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "are anti-American." He told the president that the Fab Four had come to the United States, made their money, and then returned to England to promote ideologies that were poisoning the youth. It was a staggering betrayal. Elvis, the man who had paved the way for the British invasion, the original rebel who had broken down the very doors the Beatles had walked through, was now branding them as traitors. He was attempting to burn down the temple he had helped build, hoping the smoke would signal his loyalty to the man sitting before him. Nixon listened, intrigued. This was better than he could have imagined. This wasn't just a photo op. This was an intelligence briefing from the heart of the enemy camp. Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a potential asset, a listening post in the world of pop culture. The president leaned forward, sensing the depth of the king's desire. Elvis wasn't asking for a souvenir. He was pleading for a purpose. He pulled out his collection of police badges, spreading them on the president's desk like a salesman displaying his wares. He wanted one more, the one that mattered. "I can go right into a group of hippies and get to them," Elvis promised. "They think I'm one of them." The irony was crushing. He was one of them. He was the prototype. But now, he saw them as a foreign entity, a disease for which he was the cure. He explained that with a federal badge, he could travel to any country, carrying any guns or drugs he chose. The statement was meant to convey his potential for deep cover work, but it also revealed the terrifying scope of his fantasy. He didn't just want to fight the drug culture. He wanted to operate above its laws, to become an untouchable, righteous force, a self-appointed avenger with a presidential seal of approval. Nixon, ever the pragmatist, saw his opening. Granting this strange, desperate request cost him nothing. It was a piece of metal, a title with no real authority, but in giving it, he would gain an invaluable ally and a powerful piece of propaganda. He turned to his aide, Bud Krogh. "Bud," the president said, a slight smile playing on his lips, "can we get him a badge?" Krogh, knowing the legal and bureaucratic hurdles, hesitated for a moment, but the look in Nixon's eyes was clear. This was no longer a request. It was an order. A badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was retrieved. The President of the United States stood up and walked around his desk. He held the heavy, gold federal badge in his hand. He presented it to Elvis Presley not as a politician bestowing an honor, but as a king anointing a knight. For Elvis, this was not a ceremony. It was a coronation. In that moment, he wasn't a singer. He wasn't a movie star. He was an agent. He was a warrior. He had been seen, understood, and deputized by the most powerful man on earth. As Nixon handed him the badge, Elvis did something that shocked everyone in the room. He threw his arms around the president and hugged him, an impulsive, emotional breach of protocol that somehow sealed the bizarre pact between them. Leaving the White House, Elvis was ecstatic. He floated down the steps, the cold weight of the badge in his pocket, a comforting anchor in the storm of his life. He finally had it. The ultimate authority. The proof that he was on the side of right. He boarded his private jet back to Memphis, the world outside the window a blur of insignificance. He sat in his plush captain's chair, took the badge out, and stared at its reflection. He saw not himself, but a hero, a secret guardian of a nation's soul. He believed the badge had given him power over the chaos. He was wrong. It was merely a license for his paranoia. The paranoia didn't recede. It metastasized. The badge wasn't a cure. It was a catalyst. It validated his darkest suspicions. Now, the enemies he saw everywhere were not just philosophical threats. They were targets. The hippies, the protesters, the rock stars he deemed un-American. They were all part of a vast conspiracy he was now officially sanctioned to dismantle. His quest was no longer just about collecting trinkets of authority. It had become a mission. A secret war that only he could see. As the jet cruised at 30,000 feet, he turned to Jerry Schilling, his eyes burning with a new, terrifying fire. The elation of the meeting had faded, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. He held up the badge, its gold surface catching the dim cabin light. "This is it," Elvis whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "This is what we needed?" Schilling nodded, unsure what his friend meant. He thought it was about the thrill, the honor of it all. But then Elvis leaned closer, his expression dead serious. "Now we can go to work," he said. "Now we can finally take them all down, from the inside." But what does that even mean? From the inside of what? The music industry? The counterculture? For Jerry Schilling, sitting in the jet's cabin, the words hung in the air, thick with a menace he couldn't yet comprehend. This wasn't just post-meeting adrenaline. This was something else. Something colder. Take them all down? Who was them? Elvis didn't leave him guessing for long. He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket, past the holstered pistol he now carried everywhere, and pulled out not a photograph, not a flask, but a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it with the deliberate care of a general unfurling a battle map. It was a list, a handwritten list of names, and at the very top, a name that had become an obsession for him. John Lennon, followed by others: Jane Fonda, the Smothers Brothers, George Harrison, names he saw as the high priests of the movement he so despised. To Elvis, these weren't just people with different opinions. They were enemy combatants. They were actively, consciously, working to rot America from the inside out, using their music and their fame as weapons of mass disillusionment. And he, Agent Presley, was the only one who truly understood the threat. Think about the sheer, breathtaking insanity of this moment. High above the clouds, the man who had terrified the establishment in the 1950s was now plotting to become its secret policeman. The man whose swiveling hips were once decried as a threat to decency was now targeting others for their un-American behavior. How did this happen? How does the original rebel become the state's would-be enforcer? The answer lies in a bitter, curdling jealousy. The Beatles, and John Lennon in particular, hadn't just eclipsed his fame. They had changed the very nature of it. They wrote their own songs, engaged in politics, and pushed the boundaries of what a rock star could be. Elvis, trapped in a gilded cage of formulaic movies and safe, lucrative Las Vegas shows, could only watch. He saw their intellectualism and activism not as evolution, but as an indictment of his own perceived irrelevance. They were the present. He was becoming the past, and he hated them for it. Back at Graceland, the federal badge didn't go into a display case. It became part of him. A constant presence. He'd take it out at dinner, polishing it with a napkin. He'd flash it to the Memphis Mafia, his loyal entourage, as if to remind them, and himself, of his new status. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, began to transform. It became his unofficial headquarters, a fortress in his private war. The Memphis Mafia, a group of friends and employees who had been with him for years, were now expected to be his field agents. He'd wake them in the middle of the night, his eyes wide with prescription-fueled intensity, ranting about the latest threat he'd seen on the news. He'd dispatch them on bizarre surveillance missions, to hang around coffee shops near college campuses, or to report back on the hippie element in town. They were looking for subversives, for drug dealers, for anyone who fit Elvis's increasingly broad definition of the enemy. Of course, they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. They were chasing the phantoms of Elvis's own mind. But to question the mission was to question the king, and that was unthinkable. So they played along, bringing back useless information that only fed his delusions. "Yeah, boss, lot of long-haired kids down there. Looked suspicious." It was all he needed to hear. And here, the story descends into its darkest, most tragic irony. While Elvis Presley, federal agent at large, was obsessively plotting to take down the drug culture, he himself was sinking deeper and deeper into a swamp of prescription drug abuse. The man who lectured Richard Nixon about the evils of illegal drugs was consuming a staggering cocktail of opiates, amphetamines, and sedatives every single day, all prescribed by his personal physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, a man who would become known simply as Dr. Nick. How could he not see the hypocrisy? Did he believe his own addiction was different? Righteous? Even? In his mind, it was. The drugs he took weren't for pleasure. They were a necessity. They were the fuel that allowed him to maintain the punishing schedule of a superstar. The armor that protected him from the pressures of being Elvis Presley. The hippies used drugs to escape reality. He told himself, used them to endure it. His drugs were medicine. Theirs were poison. This dangerous justification allowed him to wage war on a culture of which he was, in secret, the ultimate casualty. His paranoia wasn't just directed outward at his list. It began to poison his inner circle. He had Graceland wired with surveillance equipment. He bugged rooms. He secretly recorded conversations. He trusted no one. He started carrying a pistol with him at all times, sometimes even tucking one into his boot while on stage. He once famously shot a television set because Robert Goulet, a singer he disliked, appeared on the screen. The king's castle had become a prison, and he was both the warden and its most terrified inmate. But the badge still burned in his pocket. It demanded action. It wasn't enough to spy on students in Memphis. He needed a bigger target. He needed to prove his worth to Nixon, to the country, to himself. His obsession focused back on the top of his list: John Lennon. At the time, Lennon was living in New York City and was a vocal critic of the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration already viewed him as a genuine threat, a foreign agitator with the power to influence millions of young voters. They had him under FBI surveillance, actively looking for a reason to deport him. Elvis knew none of the specifics of the FBI's operation, but he felt it. He saw Lennon as the general of the enemy army, and he decided he was the man to bring him down. He began formulating a plan, a fantasy that blurred the lines between his movie roles and reality. He would use his fame as a cover. He would travel to New York, arrange a meeting with Lennon under the guise of wanting to collaborate or simply talk. He would get inside. He would gather intelligence. He would expose him. He pitched the idea to Jerry Schilling and another Memphis Mafia member, Sonny West. He laid it all out: the cover story, the approach, the objective. They stared at him, horrified. This was no longer just a game. This was a dangerous, unhinged fantasy involving one of the most famous people on the planet. They tried to talk him out of it, to reason with him. They told him it was crazy, that he could get hurt, that nothing good could come of it. But Elvis was beyond reason. In his drug-addled, paranoid state, their resistance wasn't caution. It was insubordination. It was doubt. Maybe, his mind whispered, they weren't fully on his side. Maybe they had been compromised. He exploded in a rage. He accused them of being cowards, of not understanding the stakes. He reminded them who he was, not just their boss, but a sworn federal officer. The badge, he claimed, gave him the authority to do whatever was necessary to protect his country. The argument fractured their relationship, planting seeds of distrust that would eventually tear his inner circle apart. So did he ever make his move? Did Elvis Presley, secret agent, ever come face to face with his arch-nemesis, John Lennon? The historical record is murky, but there are stories, whispers, from within the Memphis Mafia, of a trip to New York, of Elvis trying to locate Lennon, only to be thwarted by circumstance. Whether it's true or not is almost beside the point. The fact that he so seriously contemplated it, that he planned it, reveals the terrifying depth of his break from reality. He was no longer just an entertainer. He was a man on a mission, a self-appointed soldier in a war no one else could see. Meanwhile, what of the other man in this bizarre pact? Richard Nixon. Did he have any idea what he had unleashed? Did he know he had deputized a man who was rapidly losing his mind? Or did he simply not care? For Nixon, the meeting with Elvis was a calculated masterstroke of public relations. The photos of the president and the king were pure gold, a powerful visual statement that bridged the generation gap and showed Nixon as a man in touch with popular culture. The badge was a small, meaningless price to pay for such a propaganda victory. But there's a darker possibility. Bud Krogh, the White House aide who facilitated the meeting, would later become one of the key figures in the Watergate scandal, the head of the infamous Plumbers Unit, responsible for illegal covert operations. This was an administration that specialized in using unorthodox, off-the-books assets to fight its enemies. Is it possible they saw Elvis not just as a photo op, but as a genuinely useful, if unstable, informant? A listening post in the heart of a culture they didn't understand and deeply feared? We may never know the full truth. But what is certain is that the badge did not give Elvis Presley the purpose he craved. It did not heal the emptiness inside him. It was a prop, a toy, a piece of metal that validated his paranoia and gave him a license to indulge his darkest impulses. It was a placebo for a dying soul, and the sickness was spreading. His quest to save America was just a grand, tragic distraction from the fact that he could no longer save himself. The enemies weren't in Washington or in New York. They weren't on a piece of paper. They were in his bloodstream, in his mirror, in the lonely, silent rooms of his mansion at night. But the story doesn't end in paranoid fantasy, because Elvis didn't just plan to use his newfound power. He did. The Lennon obsession was just the beginning. So what happened when the king of rock and roll, armed with a federal shield, decided to become the law in a real-life confrontation? And who was the unfortunate celebrity that first felt his wrath? The answer might surprise you. It wasn't a protest leader. It was the crooner Robert Goulet. Yes, Robert Goulet. The story, now a legendary piece of Elvis lore, goes that one night, Elvis was watching television in his Graceland home. On the screen was the handsome, smooth-singing Goulet. Something about his performance, his confidence, his style, perhaps a memory of an offhand comment Goulet had once made about him, ignited a sudden, white-hot fury in Elvis. This wasn't just dislike. To the self-appointed federal agent, it was a violation, an act of disrespect that could not stand. His friends watched, frozen, as Elvis rose from his chair. There was no shouting, no ranting this time, just a cold, quiet purpose. He walked to a drawer, and when he turned back, he was holding one of his favorite pistols. He wasn't just a citizen annoyed with a TV show. In his mind, he was an officer of the law confronting a perpetrator. He was judge, jury, and, in this case, executioner. He raised the gun, took aim not at an electrical appliance, but at the man on the screen. The blast echoed through the mansion, followed by the pop and fizzle of the dying television set. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from a single bullet hole in the center of the screen, silencing Goulet mid-note. For a moment, Elvis stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of the gun, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He had enforced his law. He had eliminated the threat. He had asserted his control over the one thing in his life he could: the image in the box. And that is the ultimate tragedy of the badge. It was never about Nixon or Lenin or saving America from the counterculture. It was about a desperate man trying to save himself from his own irrelevance, from the crushing loneliness of his fame. He shot a television set because he couldn't shoot his own pain. The badge gave him a fantasy to live in, a role to play where he was still powerful, still in charge, a hero in a war only he was fighting. It was the ultimate shield, not against criminals, but against the truth. In the end, the real enemy was never on the outside. It wasn't the Beatles, the hippies, or the crooners on his TV. The enemy was the creeping shadow of his own decline, the addiction that held him captive, and the suffocating myth he could no longer escape. The federal badge was just one more piece of the costume, a piece of gold-plated tin meant to hide the hollow man underneath. He was the king of rock and roll, and a federal agent at large, but he died a prisoner in his own home. The story of Elvis Presley is filled with incredible moments of triumph, tragedy, and pure, unbelievable strangeness. We're here to uncover them all. To keep exploring the man behind the legend, make sure you subscribe to forever_Elvis_stories and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.